And welcome back to another episode of the Total Sports Live podcast. This is Jovan Alford, and you already know who I'm joined by, my guy, Harrison Brown, as we're about to talk about and break down the NFL draft, which happened last week in Kansas City. Your Philadelphia Eagles were busy during draft weekend. They made 2 first-round picks. They picked up a veteran running back on day 3. They added to the quarterback room. They drafted some more Georgia Bulldogs. And then they made some more pickups and signings after the draft in the UDFA period. So we're going to talk about all that here on the podcast as well. However, before we do that, make sure you're following us on Twitter at Total Sports Live. Make sure you're checking out totalsportslive.com. Make sure you're checking out Harrison's Substack as well. If you're not subscribed to that, you're missing out on some fire newsletters if you're asking me. So make sure you're checking that out. It's harrisonbrownrusso.substack.com, right?
Yep.
There we go. Yep. So make sure you're hitting that good old subscribe button because I'm subscribed. And if you're not subscribed, then we got a problem. So again, if you're looking for some NFL draft content to read on Substack, make sure you are subscribed to that newsletter right now while you're listening to this podcast. Go ahead and do it. We're also on Spotify, Google Podcast, Apple Podcast, and lastly, on any of your platforms. So anywhere you get your podcast, you can download it and listen to it there. You can also check out the video version of this podcast on Harrison's YouTube channel at Harrison Brown-Russo. So all you gotta do is go search it on YouTube. Again, same thing as a newsletter. We're making the connection here. Once you hit subscribe on the newsletter, then you go subscribe over to the YouTube page. Do both of those things, you'll be tapped into everything that Harrison does, and also to this podcast. But Harrison is glad to be talking to you, breaking down the draft. It was a very long, I don't want to say arduous process, a very fun process to go through over these last few months. So how are you doing, and how are you feeling about the 2023 NFL draft now in the books?
Well, I'm great after those plugs, man. Appreciate you for the shout outs. I'm good though. Like you said, it's been a long process for the draft. It's a process of love. You work on it for months. You start to learn all these prospects. It's really fun to see where everybody lands. You've been watching these guys since the fall and the summer. For some of them, some of the bigger name guys, and some of the guys that I've just in particular been a fan of, or maybe covered in the college football ranks and watched live for a few years. Guys like Andre Yosevas at Princeton. Been a fan of him since that 2021 season. Real cool to see him land with the Bengals. So, yeah, it's cool to see these guys finally land in their spots, see where the quarterbacks are going, see where Bryce Young is going now to Carolina, CJ Stroud, Anthony Richardson. We've been watching these guys scrutinizing every throw they make, every pro day throw they make. So to finally get the landing spots, it's real rewarding for, a lot of months of watching film and just going through the process. So, yeah, it's cool to see it finally, play out. And it's cool to see who the Eagles wind up with. The Eagles wind up with a real strong class. Like you mentioned, these Georgia Bulldogs, they keep coming in. Now it's 5 from that 2021 defense, that historic defense. Crazy to say, but not a bad theory. I'm not mad at the theory. It has to play out in the NFL. It has to play out to fruition where they have some similar success to what they had at Georgia. But it's a good idea in theory to add the best players from one of the best college football defenses ever. So, it's definitely a great time of year now that the draft is over. We're that much closer to football, one step closer. So looking forward to talking tonight.
It's to get 5 Georgia Bulldogs from that defense over the last 2 years is something that you rarely see, right?
Yeah.
Like you see that many guys drafted from a defense over, a couple years fans, but for 5 to all end up on the same team, it's kind of crazy how that all just played out between Thursday and Saturday. So let's get in right into it and talk about those Eagles, right? Like I said, Eagles made a lot of moves during draft weekend as they moved up in round 1, swapping spots with the Chicago Bears and also giving them, I think, a day 3 pick, from 2024 to take Jalen Carter out of Georgia. And then later in the first round, they took, a lot of people thought they might have took a 10 and Nolan Smith at the end of the first round. They spent 5 draft picks on defense, which was something that me and you talked about off the podcast, but just when we were, even doing our free agency shows and things like that, like knew that after years of the Eagles spending a lot of draft capital on offense, they were going to revert and spend it on defense, which they did. They also drafted Sidney Brown out of Illinois, and then they got a defensive lineman from Texas, Moro Ojomo from Texas in round 7. Then they also spent the 2 other picks on offense because they had to, but they weren't on running back on wide receiver, who many people thought the Eagles probably went there. Instead, they get the quarterback Tanner McKee out of Stanford and another offensive lineman from the University of Alabama. Started his career at Vanderbilt. An SEC guy, Tyler Steen, will be a new addition to Stoutland University for the Philadelphia Eagles. So Harrison, before we jump into UDFAs and all that other good stuff, just what was your thoughts? And if you had to give a grade, what grade would you give the Eagles on draft weekend? Because I think a lot of people didn't know what they were going to do in the first round. Would Jalen Carter be there? Would they go Nolan Smith? Do you take Peter Skoronski? Will B. John fall to you? Do you move up for B. John? Do you take Jamar Gibbs? Instead, they get the 2 Georgia defensive linemen at the beginning and at the end of the first round to book in their day 1 in the draft.
Yeah, you look at that part of it. You love that part of it. You add in Jalen Carter and Nolan Smith. I don't think many people had that mocked up or envisioned, mostly because the idea was that, in theory, those guys probably should have went a little bit higher. Jalen Carter, obviously there were some concerns. He falls to 9. The Eagles move up 1 pick to get him. You mentioned it. Only having to give up a day 3 pick next year to move up and get Jalen Carter. I like the idea of that. Similar to DeAndre Swift, they only had to give up that day 3 pick to get DeAndre Swift. You love when trades work out like that. It seems like Howie Roseman kind of has a knack for finding trades like that where there's some low-hanging fruit, a situation where a team has to get rid of DeAndre Swift. They just drafted Jahmyr Gibbs, so now you have to trade DeAndre Swift. So I think looking at it from that perspective, adding in Jalen Carter and Nolan Smith, definitely a home run in that aspect of it. I think the draft was a little bit top-heavy. I like the Tyler Steen and the Sidney Brown pick. Those are 2 solid players. I think Sidney Brown in particular is going to contribute early on special teams and compete in a crowded safety room, but it's not a solidified or answered safety room really outside of Edmonds. Reed Blankenship, an undrafted free agent last year, probably is coming in maybe as the starter, but Kevon Wallace is in there competing. Now you've got Sidney Brown competing as well, a mid-round pick this year, a guy who should be in that mix. So I think overall it's a solid class. I think the Eagles have done a pretty good job these past 3 or 4 years in particular, putting together solid classes. We talked pre-show about this. It really seems like even their draft picks and undrafted free agents, the Eagles kind of have a player profile they like. They're signing and drafting a lot of these guys from bigger schools, a lot more proven players. Jalen Carter and Nolan Smith, 2 of the most proven players in the draft class. What's the floor for them? What's the lowest they're going to be? Jalen Carter, an interior disruptive presence, a guy who's really physical and tough to stop on the inside, someone that is going to command double teams, command a lot of attention. Nolan Smith, a really athletic edge rusher, a guy with a lot of traits, a guy whose combine performance looked more like a receiver than a defensive lineman. So what's the worst possible outcome? And you look back to last year, what's the worst possible outcome for Jordan Davis, a 6'6", 350 plus pound defensive tackle who runs a sub 4.8 40, and then Nakobe Dean, the starting middle linebacker on Georgia's defense. What's the lowest possible outcome for these players? So I think they really have a player profile that they like now with the Eagles front office.
Yeah, they definitely do, and specifically those Georgia players, right? Let's jump into that because last year, like you mentioned, they get Jordan Davis, they get Nakobe Dean. We didn't really see a lot of Nakobe Dean, but we did see a lot more of Jordan Davis, even a lot more in the Super Bowl, which was kind of surprising. Like Jordan Davis was getting Super Bowl minutes, and I mean Super Bowl snaps, and I'm pretty sure Jordan Davis at the beginning of the rookie season probably wasn't thinking he was going to get Super Bowl snaps, and now turn around. Fast forward to this year, they get Jalen Carter, Nolan Smith, and then they come back in the top of day 3. Actually had to move up and give out a pick for next year or 2025, I think.
It might have been 2025. Now
yeah, 2025 moved up for Keely Ringo. I think everybody knows about Carter and knows about Nolan Smith and how they could fit in, or like they're rotational guys, right? For this year, you're thinking rotational guys for both on the defensive line that's already stacked, right? With Cox and Milton Williams and Kentavious Street and Brandon Graham and Josh Sweat, Hassan Reddick, like they're stacked. However, for a guy like Kelee Ringo, this was a guy that I think probably a lot of people had a lot of hope for at the beginning of the college football season, but kind of didn't pan out the way for him, especially in the combine where he didn't perform well. Now the Eagles get him in the 4th round. How do you envision Kelee Ringo? Like, do you see him getting any playing time this year, or do the Eagles take the Nakobe Dean route, which is using this year as a redshirt year essentially to develop them and, put them on the field in, certain situations, blowouts, things like that? Not really a bona fide starter right away. In the secondary, that's pretty stacked too.
The Nakobe Dean route makes a lot of sense. It's something we've seen the Eagles do defensively. They did it with Davion Taylor before they did it with Nakobe Dean from Colorado, the 3rd round pick. So Ringo taking that type of route with guys like Darius Slay and James Bradbury, obviously locking down the outside, Avonte Maddox on the inside, it would make some sense. If he's pressed into action, I think that might be a little bit of cause for concern. That might mean that things went wrong a little bit for the Eagles, whether that was injury or something else happening. But overall, I think it was a good pick. Like you mentioned, maybe a little bit more hype on him coming into the year, a little bit more expectations coming off the big, interception to end the national championship game back in 2021 or 2022, but the 2021 season to end that national championship game. Maybe a little bit more expectations. Struggled a little bit versus Ohio State this year, taking on that responsibility versus Marvin Harrison Jr. Marvin Harrison Jr., obviously, one of the coming into the 2024 class, the receiving prospect to talk about, the top receiver. So obviously, you're going to have to give a little bit of a grain of salt in that performance, but I think that's kind of why he was there in the 4th round. I think maybe the Eagles were a little surprised he was there in the 4th round. They went and traded up to get him, having all those Georgia Bulldogs anyway. Maybe a little surprised to see him there, early in day 3. They moved up to go get him. I like the pick. I think at some point we could see Ringo as one of those boundary corners, one of those guys starting on the outside. Obviously, it's not looking that way on paper as we start this season, but it's a good depth piece. You can never have too many guys in the secondary. The Eagles have, perennially struggled in the secondary. If you really outside of the past, I guess 2 years, really, the Eagles really have struggled. Before Darius Slay really came in the building, I would say the Eagles struggled, particularly at corner. So to add a good young corner, a guy with a proven track record, some success in college, I think it's a good pick for the Eagles.
Yeah, Kelee Ringo, you mentioned you mentioned this, right? He fits the prototype or what the Eagles are looking for at corner, right? And it just in general, but you also look at what they're doing at corner. They have more so bigger corners with the Bradburys, who with James Bradbury, for example, who is 6'1", Darius Slay, 6 foot, Greedy Williams, who they signed to a 1-year deal, 6'2". Obviously, Avonte Maddox is kind of odd man out because he's like 5'9", 5'10", but he's a slot, but that makes sense. But we're talking about outside boundary guys. Yep. Ringo kind of fits that mold where you're talking 6'2", 207. As Emory Hunt has him in his draft guide, he has him as his 8th rank boundary corner. His player comp is Xavier Rhodes, which, I mean, if you're an Eagles fan, if Kelee Ringo in day 3 becomes anything close to young Xavier Rhodes, then I think you'll take it, right?
You'd love to hear that.
Right. You love to hear that. And some of the things that Emory pointed out, and then free plug here, if you haven't gotten Emory's draft guide, I mean, it's loaded with it, chock full of like prospect profiles. Like me and Harrison has done like the yeoman's work on like most of these guys, but Emory just blows it out of the water with all the prospects. We're talking from all different levels, D1, D2, D3, NAIA, U Sports, like literally like guys that were getting picked up in UDFA signing from like small schools that me and Harrison never even heard about. Yeah. Emory had him in there. So quick plug, make sure you go get Emory's draft guide right now. But Emory had in his in the guide, he said strengths for Kelee Ringo. Very patient player out on the perimeter. He's fundamentally sound corner that has great technique. His footwork and ability to press go hand in hand. He can press both while with his feet and with his quick punch. When on the boundary, he can open up with a quick shuffle turn and stay in phase. Very good length at the position as well, which we pointed out, right? 6'2", kind of fits what the Eagles like right now at the cornerback spot. Solid in run support, knows how to abruptly close the door on the edge. Love to hear that a cornerback is good in run support, that he's not going to run away from tackle. He's going to actually embrace, stepping up. However, he says areas of improvement doesn't always play as explosive as his testing would suggest. Tests much faster than he plays. Not overly springy corner with fluid hips. He's not able to get a hand on a receiver. Any in-break and route or comebacks, it'll take him a few steps to come out of his back pedal or phase, and can be tight hip if pressed to flip them suddenly. We're looking at a guy that was 2021 freshman all SEC, in 2022 second team all SEC. So I mean, not bad accolades for the for Ringo, who, like we said, didn't have the best combine, which kind of sent his stock down a little bit. But again, for an Eagles team that you're not looking for him to start right now because you have Slay and Bradbury locked up, you're thinking about this is a potential future move. This is a future move that you're not looking for him to start right away. But if you can get him up to speed and get him where you need to be, he could be a playmaker for you maybe in the next couple of years.
Definitely. And as great as Darius Slay and James Bradbury have been, they're both, corners that are in their 30s at this point. They're both guys that are older, and we know how it is in the NFL. It can kind of go quick at the cornerback position from an elite, great corner to, on that older side of things. So to get Kelee Ringo in here, to get a younger guy in here, I like the idea of it. I think there's some things that he'll need to polish, but I think it's a good spot for him to do it. Like you mentioned, a spot where he can sit for a little bit. And how you mentioned he fits their mold. The Eagles signed 2 undrafted free agents, and I know we're going to talk about this later. Eli Ricks and Mekhi Gardner also in that 6'2" range. It really is what they like on the outside. They like those bigger body, longer rangy corners. And I think Kelee Ringo really fits that. Is going to be that boundary corner for them in the future, kind of replace James Bradbury in that mold whenever that time comes. So, and it works out well, with 5 Georgia Bulldogs on the defense. It's a good fit for Ringo. He's joining a defense with a lot of familiar faces. There's going to be some natural, cohesiveness to that defense with a lot of guys who have played together, a lot of guys who just kind of know each other, good for the locker room chemistry. I definitely like how that played out. We've seen it, with the quarterback and receivers a lot, Joe Burrow and Jamar Chase, Jalen Hurts and Devontae Smith, even, 2 Alabama guys at one point in their careers. So we've seen it on that end. I like the idea of it for the Eagles defense.
Yeah, if you're the Eagles, like you said, more cohesion, the better. Yeah. All you guys are, grew up together in college and now playing the pros together can only mean good things. Like you said with Ringo, right? It's more so, like you said, Slay and Bradbury getting up there in age. Eventually, you do have to start thinking about the future. And if he turns out, then that's, really good. And speaking of the UDFA class, why not? Let's jump into it, right? Eagles, they didn't make a ton of signings in the UDFA period, which is a little bit shocking because as Eagles fans, he would have watched Eagles. You're probably a little bit surprised because they usually go ham on UDFA signings where they load up. But where the current roster is at with a bunch of young guys after this, you probably don't need a ton of more younger guys added to the fold. But I think they did a great job in who they added to the UDFA core. More so quality over the quantity here for the Eagles. Jaden Haselwood, wide receiver from Arkansas. Another wide receiver, Joseph Ngata from Clemson. Again, a lot of people thought the Eagles might go wide receiver in the draft, but they obviously thought, hey, we can go get a couple of wide receivers in UDFA so we don't have to spend that draft capital there. They also picked up a tight end in Brady Russell, which means there's just going to be a more crowded tight end room as they have Jack Stoll, Calcaterra. Calcaterra. You have Tyree Jackson back in the fold. You do have Dallas Goedert. And you have who they signed today after doing this podcast, Dan Arnold.
I didn't know they signed Dan Arnold.
Yes, they did.
Yeah, former Panther, too. I remember him.
Yep.
And I believe former Jaguar.
Yes.
Yeah.
Former Jaguar, Dan Arnold.
Well-traveled tight end. Okay, I didn't know that.
Tight end room's a little bit stacked right now, but that's okay. Tight end room stacked with the addition of Dan Arnold. They also signed the offensive tackle Trevor Reed out of Louisville. They get a linebacker, Ben Van Sumeren.
Yeah, it's a tough last name, but yeah, good player.
They get a punter, Tyler Zetner, as Aaron Sipoff was a little bit shaky last year, so we're looking like they're bringing in competition here at punter. And then last but not least, like Harrison mentioned, at cornerback, they bring in Mekhi Garner from LSU and Eli Ricks from Alabama. Again, Harrison, second year in a row, Eagles go and spend at cornerback. Last year was Josh Jobe and Mario Goodrich were like the top headliners at DB. Now they turn around and get Eli Ricks and Mekhi Gardner, who a lot of people, college football fans, are very familiar with on their roles on their two respective teams in Alabama and LSU, who were pretty good last year, despite not being in the playoff. Still very good teams that had some players getting moved on to Sundays, and these are two guys that the Eagles are banking on. Maybe they can get something out of.
Yeah, I mean, like we mentioned, they kind of have a profile of guys they like. Eli Ricks played at Alabama this year, started his career at LSU in 2020, was second team All SEC, had 4 interceptions on the year as a true freshman, was a true freshman starting in the SEC, really had a strong season. Then in 2021, dealt with a shoulder injury, transferred to Alabama, only played in 5 games there this year before missing the rest of the season with an injury. I think that, like I mentioned for Kelee Ringo, a guy who's 6'2", kind of fits the Eagles mold, is going to compete with the likes of Josh Jobe and Goodrich. It's a little bit of a crowded cornerback room, especially with those younger guys. So, but Ricks, like I mentioned, that first team second team All SEC during his first season at LSU, and then playing at Alabama, just being in that SEC level of competition, you like the idea of that. And then Mekhi Gardner, corner at LSU, transferred there from Louisiana Lafayette, transferred after Billy Napier took the job at Florida this year. Mekhi Gardner joined the SEC as well, went to LSU. Another guy, 6'2", fits that mold this year, 8 pass breakups. And then you mentioned Trevor Reed, Jovan, Louisville's left tackle, started there for 2 years, protected Malik Cunningham, helped clear the way for that offense, an explosive offense overall. You like that there's a guy with some experience, offensive tackle experience, joining the mix there, joins in with Tyler Steen. That's 2 solid young rookies, guys for Stoutland to work with and mold and try to develop. Trevor Reed has practice squad written all over him. That would make a lot of sense for the Eagles. That's the type of guy they keep on their practice squad. And week 9, week 10, if there's some, small minor injury, someone's got a little ankle sprain, is going to miss a few weeks, you promote Trevor Reed up to the roster. So I think that makes a lot of sense. And then how about Jaden Hazelwood, a guy you mentioned, wide receiver at Arkansas, but then also caught some passes from Jalen Hurts back at Oklahoma in 2019. Obviously, not to the likes of that Joe Burrow and Jamar Chase relationship, or even Hurts and Devontae Smith, but there's some history there. There's some natural, chemistry that Hurts just understands his routes maybe a little bit more than just another undrafted free agents would have been. So, like you mentioned, maybe not the most undrafted free agents, but it's a lot of guys who fit what the Eagles like. A lot of guys what the Eagles like to do.
Yeah, no, most definitely. You're right about that. We're looking at these guys, right? Eli Ricks and Mekhi Gardner. Again, going back to Emory's draft guide, which I just love pulling from. Mekhi Gardner, his 18th ranked boundary corner in this year's class. Some of the things he spotlighted on. Solid all-around game, big physical corner who can press really well and hold his own in man-to-man coverage, which you like to see because the Eagles, even with Jonathan Gannon, they weren't really much a zone team. They were really man you up with the 2 boundary guys, and if anything, over the top safety help. So you don't got to worry about that with Mekhi Gardner, smart football player who can communicate constantly and could even develop into a safety as a pro if need be. Could benefit him to stay on this. Could be another way for him to keep a job on the roster, as the Eagles safety position is a little bit in flux right now.
Yeah.
With CJ Gardner Johnson going to the Lions and Marcus Epps going to the Raiders. Don't know how the safety battle is going to kind of figure itself out. Gardner likely won't factor into that, but just knowing that he could develop into that is a plus for him and for the Eagles. And also very good in man heavy schemes, but isn't a liability if asked to play in heavy zone ones, and very good side and length to be effective on both sides of the defense, which that is excellent to hear. And when we talk about Eli Ricks, who I just had his stuff up here, let me see. There we go. Eli Ricks, if Kelee Ringo was number 8 on the boundary corners list, Eli Ricks was number 6 on the boundary corners list. Yeah, number 6. Boundary corner, his player comparison, again, If Eli Ricks is anything close to this player, the Eagles have themselves a steal. We're talking Marlon Humphrey for a
Wow.
player comparison. Fantastic technique and footwork, very good length and body control, good ball instincts and ball awareness, good overall athleticism and ability for position, and run support shows good form and efforts on tackle attempts. I mean, I'm just loving to hear that these corners that they're getting and Ricks and Gardner and even Ringo, guys that can man up on the outside, hold their own, aren't a liability in zone, but can be effective in the run game and run defense, which I think is huge, right? Because you don't want your corners to just get picked on, and that fact that these guys can hold their own is crazy. And he has his scouting grade as a 77, and he has Mekhi Gardner's scouting grade as a 75. And if you want to kind of know what those numbers mean in the grand scheme of things, 77 in Emory's book is a solid 79 to 70 is a solid NFL starter. So that if again UDFA guys, if they do become solid NFL starters for the Eagles, you get the win right there with the depth.
Definitely. Anytime you can try to get a UDFA to become any type of contributor on your
Right.
football team, that's a win. That's what we saw with TJ Edwards at the middle linebacker position and how valuable that is to get an undrafted free agent to wind up becoming a starter. It's a real game changer. And talking about these corners, if you're loading up Madden and you want to create a corner, well, what would you make him? It's 6'2", 6'3"
Right.
guy who can press man coverage and
Yep.
lock up a top receiver. And then he's physical in the run game and can lay a big hit on a running back or blow up a screen. Like that's the type of corner that you would mock up. We love the 5'9" guys who are tough and scrappy in the slot and man up real well and contribute in the run game at their size. Like there's a spot in football for that all day. But it just makes sense if you're looking for those outside corners. That 6'2" frame, those longer guys. We're going to talk about some UDFAs as we move on here. Rajon Wright was one of my top corners in this class, and he's that 6'2", long, rangy guy, long arms, can get up, impress man coverage, is physical, has the right mentality at the cornerback position. That's really what you're looking for. And Jovan, you know this. I had Brian Branch mock draft at 10 to the Eagles,
Yep.
and a lot of that was because of his ability to play in man coverage in the slot, his position versatility in the secondary. You mentioned it with Mekhi Gardner. Maybe he can move over to safety. I could be mistaken here. I think Mekhi Gardner might have took some snaps as like a little bit of a hybrid safety or in the slot. Like I think there is some prior experience there at LSU with that. So, but that's why I was so high on Brian Branch. He's a physical guy, really sound tackler. It kind of gets lost in the fold a lot at cornerback and just the secondary as a whole. It's a passing league now. You're looking to stop the pass, but you have to be able to tackle too. I mean,
right, exactly. You don't want guys to be running past you. You got to be able to bring them down on those in breaking routes, those comebacks, because you just can't play Ole defense and they just on a comeback or in route they going because you're not making a tackle.
You're not always going to be in coverage. It's not
Right.
always just going to be one-on-one man coverage or
No.
what's your responsibility in zone. Sit back there, get 15 picks this year, and have a great season. That
Right.
doesn't exist. You're going to have
No.
to contribute in the run game, in the screen game. The quick game has continued to become more and more of a prevalent part of the NFL. Just getting the ball out of your hand, let your playmaker go make plays with these crazy, explosive edge rushers who are running 4.39s like Nolan Smith. So you got to get the ball out of your hand quick. You can't have your quarterback back there getting killed by guys who are that athletic. So that's kind of my take on these corners that the Eagles are getting for the outside. That's kind of the prototypical NFL cornerback. Although guys like Kader Kohu and these smaller corners, Miles Bryant with the New England Patriots, a 5'9", 5'10" guy, like Avonte Maddox here on the Eagles, like those type of corners definitely have a role in the NFL, and it shouldn't get overlooked in the draft prospect. Like Clark Phillips, a really talented corner out of Utah, I believe he fell to the second round this year, or it might have even been later. He fell further in the draft than he should have, and is in that 5'9", 5'10" range. Like there's a role for that, and it doesn't just have to be in the slot either. It can be outside as well.
Yeah, no, most definitely. And before we wrap up talking about the Eagles draft and we look to what happened in the rest of the draft, were you surprised that the Eagles didn't go running back? Right? Were you surprised that they didn't draft one? Because I know a lot of people thought they would draft one because of Rashad Penny, but then obviously they end up trading for DeAndre Swift, which will give them a nice stack running back by committee. But boy, you still surprised that they didn't draft him, especially with how much we talked about how loaded this was loaded of a draft class it was. And even they didn't even sign one as a UDFA. Obviously, they have some guys coming in from mini camp. TJ Cole, our Wachita Baptist, Toa Tau from Nebraska. I want to say he's from Nevada. I don't know why they have Nebraska down here. Nevada. PFS had Nebraska. I don't know where they got that one from. So only 2 running backs they really invited for minicamp and didn't, like I said, didn't sign with any UDFA or draft a running back.
Yeah, that's just been the Eagles' mold for the past 4 or 5 years. It feels like they always go and get someone in the UDFAs or the late rounds. So I was surprised. We talked pre-show about it. You kind of mentioned to me just the depth of this running back room already, though. Kennedy Brooks is still here from Oklahoma. Trey Sermon, a guy who the Eagles liked and think, pre-DeAndre Swift trade, they thought he could take on a bigger role. Maybe they still do. I know that the Eagles really like Trey Sermon. They've said that in some of their press conferences. Sirianni, he came into the league with a lot of expectations. A 3rd-round pick for the 49ers, was a popular fantasy name back in the day. So a lot of people, I had Trey Sermon stocks definitely in a lot of our leagues. So it's a name people know. So, I think when you kind of mentioned that to me pre-show, that made a lot of sense. Obviously, the DeAndre Swift trade, he's now the leader of the backfield. He's going to handle a lot of the workload. Rashad Penny mixes in nicely as a good complement to what DeAndre Swift has. And then Kenneth Gainwell and Boston Scott are now guys who have contributed here. So, I think that, when you kind of explained it to me like that, it made a little bit more sense. But just initially, just looking at the class, it is surprising that the Eagles didn't have a running back just because that's, something they've done so much and had so much success with getting those, day 3 guys or undrafted free agent running backs.
Yeah, and that's kind of been their MO over the last couple of years. So the fact they didn't do it, but again, they're so stacked that running back would be no point to even use a UDFA spot and that money on a position that they didn't necessarily need to use. This is the Total Sports Live podcast here on your various streaming platforms, and we're talking NFL draft. Me and Harrison breaking it all down for you. Before we move on to finish talking about the draft here, one more Eagles new note to point out here. The Eagles did, well, not the Eagles, but XFL wide receiver Charleston Rambo, who was the 1st-round pick of the Orlando Guardians earlier this year, received an invite to Eagles rookie minicamp. Rambo, solid player. Again, there's a connection here. Oklahoma was actually at Oklahoma with Jalen Hurts. Finished his college career at Miami. Had a solid season for the Guardians. Came on later for the Guardians as really what's that guy? Cody Latimer was really the top
from Denver.
Option. Yep, was their top receiving option. But Rambo did start to make some plays down the stretch. I think he had like over 40-something yards receiving. For over 40 plus catches and had at least 5 touchdowns. So a young prospect who I think was last year's draft class. If I'm not mistaken, Rambo was last year's draft class.
I think so, yeah.
So another body. We'll see if he can make the cut if he can make it through rookie minicamp to get on the 90-man roster, and it could benefit him because he just finished playing ball, so he's in shape coming off of a XFL season, and the fact that he got a rookie minicamp invite shows that somebody was out there was watching and looking and paying attention to him. So we'll see what happens with Charleston Rambo, see if he can make it to the next level, which is making it to the 90-man and competing for a spot in the summer and in pre-season. Now let's wrap this. Well, not wrap it up. Let's talk about our overall thoughts about the 2023 NFL draft. Harrison, was there anything that stood out to you from the draft? Because there was a lot of things that happened during the draft, from the quarterback class to like I said, the quarterback class to certain guys that we thought would go higher than where they eventually fell, and even to the point where we have to talk about only one HBCU player drafted, and not a lot of FCS guys drafted at all this year. But what were some things for you that stood out about this year's draft?
Yeah, surprising to only see one HBCU player drafted. Thought there was a number of guys that could have got drafted. I thought Isaiah Land was in
Yeah.
that 4th, 5th round range. Edge rusher out of Florida A&M. We'll talk about Andre Carter in a little bit, but this is kind of a similar type of trajectory. Isaiah Land, 15 plus sacks back in the 2021 season. This year, it was 7.5 sacks, 14.5 tackles for loss. Obviously, it's a little bit of a dip, but teams at these levels, these FCS levels and even Army's level, that you start to realize, there's an elite edge rusher, there's an elite player on one side of the field. You're going to spend some more attention to him. You're going to put more attention, chip him with tight ends, chip him with running backs. So surprised to see Isaiah Land didn't get drafted. Aubrey Miller, linebacker out of Jackson State, a guy who back-to-back years over 100 tackles. This year's SWAC Defensive Player of the Year, a Missouri transfer. James Houston, Detroit Lions, 6th-round pick last year. Edge rusher, linebacker, wound up outplaying. Well, not outplaying, but had more sacks last year. We'll say, won't say outplay, but had more sacks last year than Aiden Hutchinson when the season ended. So surprising to see Aubrey Miller didn't get drafted. Like the fit for him, signing as an undrafted free agent with the Dolphins. I think he could stick there. Kader Kohu, a guy I mentioned when we were talking about those smaller corners out of Texas A&M Commerce at the time a D2 school, wound up sticking with the Dolphins last year as a UDFA, started every game, started in the playoffs. So Aubrey Miller, it's a good spot to go to, a team that can use some of those UDFAs. But yeah, that was surprising to see. Isaiah Bolden, the draft pick to the Patriots. Dejon Warren, a corner out of Jackson State, another guy who you could argue could have got drafted, one of the top JUCO recruits in the country back in 2019 out of Lackawanna College, picked Jackson State over the likes of Georgia, Tennessee. Every big college in the country was looking at Dejon Warren out of Lackawanna College. So he's with the Bears now. We'll see if these guys can latch on. Hopefully they can make it work from the UDFA spot. Like I mentioned, guys like Kohu, Isaiah Pacheco was a 7th-round pick. Like these late round UDFA guys, there's more and more opportunities, and there's more and more talent spread across various levels of football now. Another thing you mentioned, not too many FCS guys drafted. Some guys were drafted. Cody Malk, Tucker Kraft, the Dakota guys, they had a lot of buzz. They got drafted early. McClendon Curtis went undrafted, guy out of Tennessee, Chattanooga. So some of those offensive linemen, some of those tight end got drafted. Great to see Yosevas get drafted. Mentioned that earlier as we started the show, to the Bengals in the 6th round out of the FCS ranks. And a lot of those FCS guys got undrafted free agent looks and minicamp looks. But yeah, I mean, listen, it kind of contradicts what I was just talking about a few minutes ago with the Eagles profile. They like these guys from bigger schools and more established schools, Alabama, Clemson's. That winds up hurting guys from the FCS ranks, from the HBCU ranks, from the D2 ranks. I haven't heard of any D3 prospects this year. We've been in the weeds for a while. I mean, unless we're missing some guys, I'm sure they're out there. I'm sure they're going to mini camps and signing with USFL teams and arena teams across the country. But, just haven't heard many D3 names this year. So I think that's one thing. But, as we move to some of those bigger names, I think the quarterbacks, as we look at this quarterback class, generally speaking, it played out how it was supposed to, especially with those top 3. Looking at Bryce Young going to Carolina, C.J. Stroud, a lot of buzz pre-draft that C.J. Stroud might not go to. They wanted an edge rusher, and C.J. Stroud, the S2 scores, whatever that means. The S2 scores are bad, and all that. A good lesson for the draft process. The buzz that happens in the 10 days prior to the draft. If you're hearing something April 15th on that you haven't been hearing since August, it might not be the best thing to listen to. We get caught up in that every year with Twitter and, these TV shows and all that. But C.J. Stroud at 2 to the Texans made a lot of sense. And then Anthony Richardson at 4 to the Colts made a lot of sense. I think he fits really well with Shane Steichen and that offense, what they like to do, not just because of, you look at what Jalen Hurts did last year, but you also go back to Steichen's days with the Chargers, the success he had with Justin Herbert, a big arm passer who likes to throw the ball downfield. That sounds like Anthony Richardson. That sounds like what Anthony Richardson did at Florida. So I really like that fit. Will Levis to the Tennessee Titans, a bit surprising. We had heard that a lot, that the Titans maybe were looking to move up. The Titans were really interested in Levis in that day 2 range, and then they traded up to go get him. It's just surprising because, myself in particular, Malik Willis was my number 1 quarterback last year, ahead of Kenny Pickett, who I was also a big fan of, a Jersey guy. But Malik Willis was my number 1 quarterback in last year's class. I had him mocked in that 1st round range. I was surprised when he fell to the 3rd round. I get that he played at Liberty. Maybe it's not the level of competition people want, But I thought with his athleticism, his arm, the talent that he had, I thought he had a lot of upside for the NFL. This year with Tennessee, I don't feel like they tailored the offense around Malik Willis. I feel like they put him in some really tough spots, didn't give him the opportunity to really succeed, had him only throwing the ball 14, 15 times a game, didn't really get him going on the ground, didn't really tailor things to what he liked to do. So to see them move up, to spend that day 2 pick on Will Levis, it's a bit surprising. I'm not out on Will Levis as a pro quarterback. I think he's a guy with a big, strong arm, a compact throwing motion, had some real moments in 2021 in particular where he really did look like a strong NFL prospect. Just a bit of a surprising fit. It really wasn't my positional need for the Titans. I think they have a lot of other things they could have addressed. They hadn't addressed receiver at that point in the draft. Their defense could still use a little bit more polishing. So it wasn't my favorite pick overall, but I think Will Levis could fit in that Titans offense and do some good things with Derrick Henry, Treylon Burks. Like there's some talent there that he could have a nice career, but just wasn't where I would have went.
Yeah, no, and I want to hit on some of the points that you brought up, and why not start at going back to the quarterbacks, right? And the Levis selection, like you said, very puzzling decision. Just because, again, I personally feel like the Titans sabotaged Malik Willis, and not really when he was called into duty, not really developing him for the situation, being ready, and also not even I won't even say developing him, right, but more so just game planning the offense around him, right? I didn't feel like they did their due diligence to make the game simple for him, right? I didn't see where, because the Titans are really not a new age style of offense, if you get what I'm saying, like with read options, RPOs, things like that. Like they're more so under the center type of team, which is cool, but I understand you got Derrick Henry, but eventually you do have to develop your young quarterback, because then it looks horrible when you're in playoff positioning for a division that AFC South to AFC South, to the point where you went and go sign a veteran quarterback for the last 2 weeks of the season to make a playoff push. Like, what does that say to your fan base, number one, but also says to the young quarterback that you drafted in the 3rd round, fan? Like, you're basically almost giving up on him at that point. Like, we don't trust you enough in the situation, when it should fall down to the coaches to put him in that situation to succeed. And I feel like they didn't necessarily do that. Now we're expecting them to potentially do the same thing with Will Levis. Like, are they going to do that with Levis? Because again, I don't understand adding Levis to this situation when, again, you didn't show last year that you could fairly develop Malik Willis. Now you're going to put Levis in the situation where it doesn't make sense, right? I mean, only thing I could think of something close to this is what, like Cousins and RG3.
Yeah,
like the closest
that's a good one
of like this kind of thing happening. But RG3 had a pedigree, right, coming out of Baylor. Malik Willis, a pedigree out of Liberty, really good quarterback. Will Levis, solid quarterback out of Kentucky in the SEC, but again, I don't trust the Titans to develop Malik Willis, and Levis, I just don't see it, because like I said, the drafting of Levis more so does a disservice not only to him, but a disservice to Malik Willis, because again, what are you telling Malik Willis at that point? Like, hey, we drafted you in round 3, but now we're going to turn around and draft you in round 2. Like, what did Will Levis do in the draft process, or even what you saw at Kentucky, that made you say, yeah, he's the guy? And I guess we'll figure that out during preseason and training camp, see how that battles out. I think more so the preseason games, I think, is going to be the real eye test to see if Malik Willis can kind of really make the point and stand like, hey, like, do not forget about me in this equation. And, going back to the HBCU FCS role talking point there, again, something else that was mad puzzling, right? From an HBCU's perspective, but also from an FCS perspective, because a lot of football fans, they just focus on P5, Group of 5, anything that's on ABC, CBS, ESPN, ESPN2, right? They're really not focusing on anything else. And the fact that you only have 10 to 11 FCS players, which only includes one HBCU player drafted in 7 rounds of the NFL draft, 259 picks, that don't that doesn't sit right with me just because, and maybe this is me, maybe this is because it's us. We see football differently. We know there's more talent out there than just what's being shown in the primetime windows at 3:30 on a Saturday and 7:30 on a Saturday, right? There's more talent out there, but these guys aren't necessarily getting the benefit of the doubt, where we're now seeing all these guys being like we mentioned, right? UDFA minicamp guys when they shouldn't be, right? A lot of these guys shouldn't be. Isaiah Land should not be a UDFA signing.
Yep.
Lindsey Scott should not be a UDFA. He should not be a UDFA signing at all. There's so many guys that I can think of off the top of my head, right? Mark Evans, who had a lot of buzz coming out of Arkansas Pine Bluff, should not been, a UDFA signing. Xavier Smith, who really blew up at the Legacy Bowl and just performance put on the HBCU Combine, it should not been a UDFA based off of just not what he did there, but also just what he was able to do at Florida A&M, which is probably one of the best HBCU football programs out here, but also one of the better FCS programs out here.
Yep.
And talking about in general FCS, where the Rattlers are actually competing for playoff spots. And if they're not playing the Celebration Bowl, which they haven't been, they've been in the FCS playoff a couple times. So to see that, and to see the lack of small school guys not get an opportunity, it bothers me, because I feel like these guys do deserve a shot. They do deserve a chance to, play in the NFL. But I also think this is what is also, great for leagues like the XFL, the USFL, CFL, for these guys to get a legitimate shot to go play, right? And not fight for a UDFA spot, can go into an XFL or a USFL, right? And get playing time, right? We see a lot of guys, and we were going through the list right before the show, saying like this guy was a USFL draft pick, Darius Hagens, who I think is a UDFA signing, but he was assigned, Virginia State running back. He was signed, he was a USFL draft pick. Chase Bryce, you minicamp guy, but also USFL draft pick. Malik Ham, USFL draft pick. Isaiah Land, USFL draft pick. Keenan Isaac, I think Keenan Isaac, Benny Sapp. The list goes on and on. Truman Jones, like all these guys, small school guys, are USFL draft picks, but they're not NFL draft picks. And I get it. The NFL, you're talking about the 1% of the 1%, right? You're talking about the 100. But I think for me personally, I just want to see these guys, if the NFL is not going to give an opportunity, give them a chance, that they do decide to, take the other route of, exploring these leagues and getting a chance to really, get those reps, get those playing times, whether that be XFL, USFL, CFL, even in arena ball. Like, go get your reps, go get your snaps. That's the only way you're going to be able to do anything out here. Get those reps, get that game film. Don't be content with just trying to compete for a rookie minicamp spot when it's not guaranteed that you'll even make it through the weekend, to get to the potential 90 man to get signed. So those are the things that just bother me. And just to piggyback on one thing before we, wrap up with best UDFA fits, for me, seeing Malik Cunningham go undrafted over a guy like Sean Clifford really annoyed me for some reason, because Sean Clifford, like, no disrespect, he was a okay quarterback, but he wasn't nothing great at Penn State, right? Like, he was mid. If I'm going to be honest, he was mid. And I did not see him being drafted, right? And to see him going 5th round to the Packers at that, he might have got drafted over DTR, if I'm not mistaken. He
same round. I don't know where it was, but
same round. But to see him get drafted over a guy like Malik Cunningham, who, granted, he doesn't have the gaudy pass numbers like, Bridgewater and, Lamar coming out of Louisville, right? But we talking about schools, right? Louisville has produced 2 NFL quarterbacks, including an NFL MVP at quarterback. Malik Cunningham goes undrafted. I mean, he gets picked up for the Patriots, which is great, but I don't know how that works for the Patriots because they did the same thing with De'Aaron King, and that didn't work out because they wanted to switch him back to positions. And now De'Aaron King is flourishing in the USFL at his natural position. And you see the report that I literally just caught wind of today, just looking up stuff on Malik Cunningham and the Patriots. He's reportedly open to switching positions, and you got NFL executives saying, like, yeah, I see him better as a wide receiver. It bugs me to hear that too, because it's like Malik and me and you, again, me and Harrison talked about this many times, and even, off air, when we were talking about Cunningham, I think last week during the draft, when I said to him, like, if he don't get drafted, it's best bet to go to USFL and get those reps as a quarterback. And like you mentioned to me before, and I forgot about this, right? You mentioned, like, hey, he did say he doesn't want to be there. But if I'm Malik Cunningham, and this is just me, I'm not switching positions when I know I can play the game as a quarterback. And if I have an opportunity in the USFL to get reps, to get film as a quarterback for one of the best teams in the USFL, defending champion, that's doing things with their quarterbacks. They did a lot with Jamar Smith. They're doing a lot with Alex Magoo right now. We saw Jalen Morton get into the game last week out of Prairie View A&M, get into the game as well. I think he went to Prairie View. Somebody can check me on that. But yeah, it's kind of puzzling for me. So yeah, that's my soapbox. That's my soapbox on this.
Yeah, Malik Cunningham, I had him as my 6th ranked quarterback in this class. I've been high on him throughout the process. You kind of mentioned some of the passing numbers. I think some of that is this year. He missed some time with a concussion and just missed some time overall. I think there was another injury as well, I believe. Yeah, I think he had the concussion, and then I believe he either missed time or sustained another injury and might have played through it. But you look at some of his other numbers, he's leaving Louisville really as their number 2 offensive player in a lot of the all-time categories, behind Lamar, even
which had a lot of quarterbacks, right? That kid with a lot of quarterbacks, Lamar, Teddy, Brian Brown. Come on, man.
There, right. You look at that offense too, what Louisville did. A lot of the highlight clips and probably what people have seen of Malik Cunningham on Twitter and things like that are going to be the runs, but a lot of really challenging throws, a lot of opposite hash throws, a lot of downfield throws, a lot of out routes, a lot of tight window throws over the middle of the field. Like, there's a lot of upside with Malik Cunningham in the pocket as a pure passer. And it's something we see a lot with quarterbacks. They try to move in different positions. One of my favorite quarterbacks in the draft process early in my days, really watching a lot of these guys, was Quentin Flowers at a USF. USF's all-time leader in basically every offensive category, every passing category there is, every quarterback rushing category there is. Had some unbelievable college games where it's 6 or 7 touchdowns. The Bengals initially bring him into camp. They move him to running back. Tampa Bay has him in the XFL. They've got him in a quarterback competition with Taylor Cornelius. They're giving a lot of reps to Cornelius. It's disappointing to see when these quarterbacks don't get an opportunity to play the position that they're naturally best suited for. And we even saw it with Lamar Jackson coming out in that 2018 class. The questions, how would you feel about playing receiver, more like a running back, these types of, narratives and portrayals that the media puts out and just people in football in general put out. It's really a disservice to a group of really talented quarterbacks, guys that can play the position at a high level, can make talented deep field throws, and then also be an athletic quarterback that can make people miss in the open field, can really be dynamic in the red zone. And that's where I'm going to look on the bright side for Malik Cunningham with this fit with New England. I think if they were to properly use him as a red zone type of quarterback to supplement Mac Jones and Bailey Zappi, whoever it winds up being later on in this season at quarterback, if they can use Malik Cunningham in the red zone to complement that, because they get down there a lot. The Patriots use that short, quick hit offense, hand the ball off, try to, just chunk off, get 5 yards here, 5 yards there. They wind up in the red zone a lot. In theory, Malik Cunningham brings something they've never had in the red zone.
That is true.
That would be how I would look
Cam
at
Newton.
it. Yes, that's a great point. Since Cam Newton, they did have it that year with Cam Newton, and that was a big part of Cam Newton's success in New England. That's a great point. I honestly completely forgot about the Cam Newton COVID year in New England, how much success he had in the red zone. So that would be how I would look to use Malik Cunningham early in his career. Like you mentioned, the USFL would be a great fit for him if he was looking to develop some reps. I think that's a great league for young quarterbacks in general. They kind of tailor their game a little bit more and their roster building a little bit more towards those young quarterbacks. So that would be a great fit for Malik Cunningham. I'm looking forward to seeing how his NFL career plays out. I think it's a guy with a lot of really unique traits. In my opinion, was the best athlete in the quarterback class. I know Anthony Richardson at 6'4", 240 is a really unique athlete, and all those types of things. It's really two different type of players. But when you look at just Malik Cunningham's speed on the field, I think he was the best in the class.
Yeah, definitely. Speed at the quarterback position. Yeah, definitely a crazy, just outstanding playmaker. And hopefully we'll see what he can do with the Patriots as a quarterback. But if not, hey, Malik, it's always a spot for you in the USFL.
Yeah.
They do have your draft rights. So, I mean, there is an opportunity for not only for him, but for all the guys right there, UDFAs that, were drafted in the USFL, even if you don't get this NFL shot, right? And I think this is so great for what the USFL did with their inaugural first year player draft, drafting those players to give them almost inadvertently a safety net. Like, hey, you guys if you guys don't make it or whatever, we do have an opportunity for you. And actually, there have been some guys that were part of this year's draft class, not highly rated or anything, that didn't even get drafted or didn't even worry about their draft. They went ahead and just signed into the USFL because they see the opportunity, right? Get the reps, get the playing time, start your pro career early. So,
right.
Hey, we'll see what happens there for Cunningham and for all those guys, right? FCS, HBCU players, quarterback class, in general. And before we wrap here on the podcast, gotta talk about best UDFA fits. We wrote down just a few names on our list. And so many more. Like I said, me and Harrison went through the list, and it was just so many UDFAs and the teams that they're on where they could make not only a 90-man, but could stick on a 90-man, obviously, but could make a push for that 53-man game day roster. Harrison, just quickly, before we wrap, who are some guys that think are in a good situation as a UDFA?
Yeah, I was a big fan of Andre Carter. I mentioned him when we were talking about Isaiah Land, the guy who really had a big 2021 performance. I like that signing for the Vikings. I think that's an NFL caliber pass rusher, 6'6" frame, production in college, should have been a draft pick. Rajon Wright, a guy who, Jovan, I've been high on throughout this process. I think I mentioned him a little bit ago when we were talking about those 6'2" corners, Eli Ricks, and those types of guys. Rajon Wright is one of those types of guys. I think he pairs really well with J.C. Horn, physical type of guys, and then Dante Jackson in the mix there as well. We talked about Malik Cunningham. Malik Ham, a guy who I've been a big fan of, the Lafayette defensive end, outside linebacker, really talented pass rusher, leaves Lafayette with 32 sacks. Also love his versatility to be a true outside linebacker, not just a guy who gets after the quarterbacks, can line up and cover the slot, contribute in that type of role. So love that. We didn't mention when we were talking about some of these HBCU guys that could have and should have got drafted, Shaq Davis, receiver out of South Carolina State, 29 receptions, over 600 yards this year. Do the math there.
Which is a crazy split.
Yeah, right. Do the math there. That's a deep threat. And coming in at 6'4", having those types of numbers, a lot of upside. And then Jadakiss Bonds, you mentioned Xavier Smith.
One of your favorite guys.
He was. Xavier Smith and him, very different receivers, very different frames. Two really complete receivers, though, and guys that were super productive for a long period of time at their schools. So those were two that I was a big fan of. Jadakiss Bonds went to the 49ers. I think I might have missed Malik Ham. Malik Ham went to the Ravens, and then Shaq Davis went to the Saints. Truman Jones, Harvard DN, going to the Chiefs. Tyreek Pitts, Delaware receiver, going to the Bears. Another guy who was super productive. I could go all night. I'll wrap here with two offensive tackles going to Denver. Henry Bird out of Princeton. I mentioned it with Yosevas. Covered Princeton. Watched a lot of Henry Bird, their left tackle. Really consistent guy. And then Alex Palczewski, another guy. I mean, you want to talk about consistency, a guy with 713 consecutive snaps to finish his college career without allowing a sack, and a Big Ten record 65 starts. Two offensive tackles, maybe swing guards, joining the Denver Broncos. I think that is going to be important for their offensive line moving forward.
Yeah, most definitely. And all those names, right? I think all those names we're going to be definitely looking out for to see how they do in mini camp, especially Shaq Davis, because I think he got one of the more noticeable higher guaranteed deals as a UDFA.
It's a crowded room for him in New Orleans. I was looking at that New Orleans room. Keith Kirkwood is back there, a Temple guy. Yeah, a Temple guy who's back there now. And then they drafted A.T. Perry, who's 6'5", coming out of Wake Forest. So that's a similar type of frame to Shaq Davis. Like those three are going to wind up in a competition. They're all in that bigger body, taller target type of guy. Like, and there's only so many spots there. You know, the Saints have a crowded room in general. So
yeah, a lot of competition.
there is a lot of comp there.
A lot of competition.
Yeah.
For me, UDFA fits for me. Xavier Valladay out of Arizona State. From Arizona State, he signed a deal with the Texans. Again, he's almost like Shaq Davis. I like the player in Valladay. I think, to me, I envision an RB2 right away with just the way that he runs the ball. He doesn't really do a lot of dancing, really hits the whole north-south, runner, physical running back. Also, what I do like and what I love in all my running backs, if they can, catch the ball at the backfield. And he did that pretty good on the ASU team that really wasn't great at all offensively in general. But like we talked about with Shaq Davis in a crowded room in Houston, where you have Damian Pierce, Devin Singletary, who I forgot is in Houston. I totally forgot.
I forgot about that too.
Devin Singletary there. They also have Mike Boone, who was my favorite running back to pick up on Madden.
Yeah, former Bengal.
Former Viking.
He didn't play for he did play for the Vikings.
He was a Viking.
Too many draft names, too many names. The names are all swirling. Yeah, it's
right. So we got Mike Boone, and then we have Dare Ogunbowale, who is the brother to Dallas Wings guard Arike Ogunbowale.
I know.
Yes, the more you know. So yeah, crowded room for Valladay. But the fact that he got signed as a UDFA, that's only can mean good things. If he can't, honestly, I think there's a chance he could beat out Ogunbowale and Boone for that third running back spot. Obviously, not beating out Singletary for 2, but I think there is a pathway for him to at least be running back 3 and be on the active roster. And if we know if with D'Amico Ryans coming from San Francisco, and I think his offensive coordinator is also from San Fran, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes. Yep. Bobby Slowick.
And knowing how they use running backs and multiple running backs, maybe there's a chance we do get a little Valladay action. With just knowing how San Fran rotates like 3 to 4 different, running backs in their backfield. And then for me, last guy, we talked about him not too long ago, Xavier Smith. I think this is you talk about perfect fit. The Los Angeles Rams depth chart. Talk about a team that needs young, talented players, playmakers. He fits the bill here. You look at their wide receiver room, it's really in trouble, Harrison. If you were doing a Madden franchise with this team, you would be signing players too on this depth chart, because they got Cooper Kupp, they got Van Jefferson, who's really turned into an excellent player for where he was drafted at. But we're talking about, after that, we're talking Ben Skoranek. We're talking Tutu Atwell, who surprisingly got some playing time last year out of necessity, but we did see some Tutu for a guy. You talk about a guy on the smaller side. He's on the smaller side of 160, 5'8" or something like that, 5'9". He's a small wide receiver. They also got Lance McCutcheon, who was kind of like the star of the preseason last year, if I'm not mistaken. Braxton Burmeister is also on this roster. I think he was the former quarterback at Virginia Tech. Then he switched to wide receiver, I think, to San Diego State. I think. Don't hold me to it. Puka Nakua, Tyler Hudson, Austin Trammell, and Xavier Smith. So ESPN does have Xavier Smith on this list here. 5'10", 170 out of FAMU. Have him as the third wide receiver behind Skoranek and Austin Trammell. I feel like if Smith can show that same playmaking ability that he did at Florida A&M, and then if he can bring that versatility to maybe special teams, I really think there's a clear path for him, because outside of Jefferson and Kupp, I feel like wide receiver 3, 4, 5, 6 is really up for grabs out in LA.
Very open. And I think he's going to fit in well with what they do out there in LA. A guy who you can get the ball on a quick screen to. He can make people miss in the open field, can contribute in the middle of the field, a sure-handed pass catcher. I like the fit. I could see him in that 4 or 5 role. Puka Nakua from BYU is another nice pickup, taller guy, 6'2". Didn't actually know that they had signed him. I didn't even see that in the undrafted free agent, list and stuff. But Xavier Smith head in there, really productive at Florida A&M. A guy with over 200 catches. Like you said, I like the fit a lot. I think that's the perfect type of fit for him in that UDFA range.
Yeah, definitely perfect fit. So we're going to see how it all pans out here, not only for the Eagles, but for all the guys that we talked about as we put the final bow and wrap on the 2023 draft class. Now it's on to the 2024 class. Caleb Williams, Drake May, Michael Penix, Shedeur Sanders maybe are up next. John Reese Plumlee is up next.
John Reese Plumlee. I'm already going to be too high on him on my board. The baseball background, the
right,
true sport athlete, the mobility on the field. That's a guy who, that's a whole other podcast. That's a whole other podcast.
2024 guys.
Let's enjoy some baseball for a couple weeks here. All right. I'm all about football. I'll watch as much football, as humanly possible. All right. But let's enjoy some baseball here. It's May. We've got a long road ahead for that 2024 class. College football season in June, July range. We'll really start gearing up, but I think it's time to watch some Phillies baseball these next few weeks.
Definitely. Phillies baseball. The Sixers are still in action.
Yes.
Sixers are still in action in the playoffs. Still got the Stars in the USFL. So definitely a lot of things to watch for. CFL season starting them very soon as well.
It does.
So a lot of stuff to watch out and check out before we even dump into 2024. Trust me, folks. There will no NFL draft 2024 podcast coming in the near future. So
give us some time.
Yeah, give us some time. We will reload, but not yet. Like I said, got a lot of stuff to talk about on Philadelphia sports. Harper, Embiid, Sixers, a lot of stuff here. But that is going to wrap up this week's episode of the podcast. Again, really appreciate everybody for tuning in and checking out the podcast. As always, like I said earlier, you can find this podcast on all your available streaming platforms. Make sure you download, subscribe, leave a review. We really appreciate it. Make sure you're following Harrison on Twitter at Harry Brown-Russo. I forgot to have the little screen rolling up too.
That's all right.
Stuff. It's been a minute since we did a podcast.
You're right.
All out of rhythm. So make sure you follow Harrison on Twitter at Harry Brown-Russo. Me on Twitter at Jovan10, at Total Sports Live, totalsportslive.com. Make sure you're subscribed to Harrison's newsletter, harrisonbrownrusso.substack.com. Make sure you go over there right now and subscribe so you get all his latest newsletters and musings. And also make sure you're subscribed to his YouTube page, Harrison Brown-Russo, on there as well. Hit the subscribe button on there. Watch all his vids that he's done on the draft. A lot of good stuff and more stuff coming always in the near future. So from me and Harrison, everyone have a good one, and we'll talk to you guys next week. We'll come up with something to talk about next week.
We'll be back. Yeah, there's a lot to talk about.
A lot to talk about. We'll figure it out. Everyone have a good one. We'll talk to you soon.